Welcome back to another episode of Opal Wave MTG, a channel dedicated to exploring power levels in EDH and helping you tune your deck to your meta. I'm your host Jacob, and today we've got a recommended deck tech from Dylan Pruitt. So thank you so much, Dylan Pruitt, for recommending Velomachus Lorehold. I had a lot of fun brewing these three decks today. Also, I recently hit 150 subscribers, so a huge thank you to everyone that has been liking, commenting, and subscribing to the channel. It lets me know that what I'm doing people like, and yeah, so I really appreciate it. So, Velomachus is a 7 mana Boros, which is red and white legendary Elder Dragon with flying, vigilance, and haste. And it says, whenever Velomachus Lorehold attacks, look at the top 7 cards of your library. You may cast an instant or sorcery spell with mana value less than or equal to Velomachus Lorehold's power from among them without paying its mana cost. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. And this commander, pretty straightforward. You want to put some instants and sorceries in your deck. You want to cast them for free by powering out your commander. And that's pretty much, what we've done with these decks. Each one kind of features instants and sorceries in different ways and how we can abuse those. As usual, the deck lists are going to be in the description below, and if you want to support the channel, check out my Fiverr. That will also be in the description below. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. So with the Skirmish version, which is our lowest power level, we've got a bunch of dudes that essentially deal damage when we cast instants and or sorcery spells. We've added a Torbrand to increase the damage that we deal with our pinger guys, as well as an Atali, just as general value. Stormkill Artist, also a very powerful card in a deck that wants to be slinging a lot of instants and sorceries. Chandra's Incinerator is also another really great include for pinging players when we cast our instants and sorceries. In the sorceries, we've got a good bit of ways so we can basically discard a card and to draw more cards. And generally these are, they're neutral in terms of the card advantage, but if we're casting them off of Velomachus, they will actually generate card advantage for us since we're not discarding. Essentially, if you have to cast it from your hand, you use that card plus the additional resource to draw 2 cards. So you only go even, but since it's coming from your library and Velomachus' ability, you essentially discard 1 card to draw 2 cards. So it ends up being card draw positive, essentially. Imposing Grandeur is also a really sweet card. Basically, each player can choose to discard their hands and draw cards equal to the mana value of their commander. And since we have a 7 mana commander, we can essentially draw an entirely new hand with the Imposing Grandeur. Cleansing Nova can also be a really nice board wipe in addition to the Blasphemous Act. We can't hit Blasphemous Act off of Velomachus, which is a little unfortunate, but I still think it's good enough that we want to run it. Mizzix's Mastery, once we get a bunch of instant sorceries in our graveyard, we can overload this and get a bunch of triggers with our guys. So it's going to be a great way for us to end the game. Deafening Clarion can serve as a board wipe, potentially. Depends on how small the guys are. And it can also give our creatures lifelink until the end of turn. So if we're about to cast a few instant sorceries and get some triggers off, we can give these guys lifelink and gain a little bit of life. Seize the Day, just so we can get an extra attack off with Velomachus. It should be noted that because of the way that Seize the Day is worded, it doesn't work as you would think it would if you hit it off of his attack trigger. And that's mainly because Seize the Day says after this main phase, there is an additional combat phase followed by an additional main phase. So if you don't cast this spell during a main phase, it will not, basically you won't get an additional combat phase because it's not after this main phase if you're casting it during combat. So a little bit of a, a wombo or an anti-wombo combo, but still a pretty good card that we can cast before combat or even after combat during one of the main phases and get some extra Velomachus triggers. And the instance, a good bit of removal, as well as a few more ways that we can discard cards and get some extra value. Shattering Pulse and Allay are both really interesting. Since they have buyback, if we cast them with Velomachus, we can pay that buyback cost because it is an additional cost that you pay as you cast the spell. So you pay, you cast it for free, pay the buyback, and then you can put it back into your hand. So decent way to essentially just get some extra removal out of your stuff. Repeater Reverberation, another really cool one. We can cast this off of Velomachus, and then we can cast the spell normally and get a bunch of value off of that. And again, just a bunch of removal. Maybe a few ways to give Velomachus double strike if you want to try and close out the game, like Psychotic Fury or Unleash Fury can double the power of a creature. And we got a few really sweet artifacts that are gonna help us close out games. So stuff like Dynavolt Tower, we can get energy as we cast instants and sorceries, and then we could pay 5 energy and tap it to deal 3 damage to any a creature or player. Geistfleet Reservoir can also gain the charge counters, and you can remove any number of charge counters from it to deal that much damage to any target. Sphinx's Bone Wand is a classic. I think it's a lot of fun. You don't really see it too much anymore. It's 7 mana, so it's pretty costly, but as you cast spells, you put a charge counter on it, and then you can deal damage to any target equal to the amount of charge counters on Sphinx's Bone Wand. So it starts off slow at first, but once you've cast a few instants and sorcery spells, this card is going to start doing a lot of damage. Mirari is also another cool way we can copy our spells. So since we're casting them for free off Velomachus, we get to pay an additional 3 and copy that spell. Spellbinder can also allow us to remove an instant from our hand, put it on the Spellbinder, and then we can start swinging at someone and get some extra value out of there. Pyromancer's Goggles, a really cool artifact if you're in red and doing some spell slinger type stuff, since it lets you copy the spell that you are casting with it, as long as you use the red mana that it produced. And in the enchantments, Arcane Bombardment, I think this card is a lot of fun. So whenever you cast your first instant or sorcery spell each turn, you get to exile an instant or sorcery at random from your graveyard, and then you cast all spells exiled with Arcane Bombardment. And this happens once every turn. So since we have a lot of instants, we can potentially get this to trigger multiple times in a turn cycle. And if you've got like Thrill of Possibility and an Unexpected Windfall and a big score underneath it, you're going to start getting a lot of card advantage and getting a lot of triggers off of our pinger dudes. So really cool card in this deck. Aria of Flame, even though it's going to give each opponent 10 life when it enters the battlefield, it's very much like the Sphinx's Bone Wand, where eventually, as you cast your instants and sorceries, you're going to start dealing a lot of damage to players, definitely more than the 10 that you gave everyone at first. Legion's Initiative is just a pretty fun way for us to kind of dodge board wipes or removal potentially with the Legion's Initiative, and can also just makes Velomachus a 6/6, so nothing crazy, since we don't have a ton of like instant sorceries that cost more than 5. So most of the time our Velomachus, well, actually all the time our Velomachus, if it finds an instant or sorcery, you're going to be able to cast it. So the extra damage though can definitely be nice. And in the lands, nothing crazy. Good bit of basics. If you're doing a basic heavy deck and you're in 2 color or possibly even 3 color, just make sure that you're checking out your color distribution. Since we are primarily in red, most of our lands are basic lands rather, are going to be the mountains, and then we also have artifact ramp that can kind of help fix colors as well. But yeah, a lot of cheap lands that are in tap. Sunhome can give double strike to Velomachus to kind of help us close out games, and then a few dual kind of lands that help us cast our spells a little bit easier. And moving on to the battle version, changing it up a lot here. We are doing a Dragon's Approach deck, and if you're not familiar with these, Dragon's Approach, you can have any number of cards named Dragon Approach in your deck. And essentially Dragon's Approach, 3 mana, deal 3 damage to each opponent. And then you can exile the Dragon's Approach you cast, as well as 4 other Dragon's Approaches from your graveyard, tutor for a dragon, and put it into the battlefield. And a lot of times when I see Dragon's Approach played, there are a good bit of sacrifices in removal. And it's really hard to balance these decks in general, just because once you hit, like, I mean, most of the budget in terms of, you know, space, how much space you have, is dedicated to the Dragon's Approach if you want it to be any kind of consistent, right? So you just want to make sure when you're brewing these type of decks where you can run any number of the cards, that you aren't, you know, sacrificing, you know, removal slots in order to get as many cards as possible named Dragon's Approach into your deck. Again, we've got that Chandra's Incinerator, mainly because off of one Dragon's Approach, it's going to make Chandra's Incinerator cost 1. And then further, you know, the Dragon's Approaches for the rest of the game with this Incinerator out are going to deal 3 damage to your opponent, but then you get to deal 3 damage to a creature that each opponent controls. So super strong card in these Dragon's Approach type decks. We've got a Dockside to help us ramp a little bit. And then our 3 main dragons, Utvara Hellkite, Still Hellkite, and his Scourge of the Throne. Again, we don't need a ton of dragons in these decks, mainly because you're not really going to be, you know, using that extra ability very often. You're maybe going to do it once or twice in a game at most. You know, the exile 4 other Dragon's Approaches plus the original to get your dragon out. So you don't need to put a billion dragons into your deck in order to make the Dragon's Approach work. You really want the Dragon's Approach to do most of the work for you, and then eventually you can, you know, get 1 or 2 really strong dragons out. And the ones that I chose, Scourge of Valkus gives us extra combats, which is super strong with Velomachus in general. Still Hellkite is really great for dealing with board states, and Utvara Hellkite, if left alone, will generate a ton of 6/6 dragons that will just beat our opponent's faces in. And again, we've kind of made a few upgrades. We've added some ramp like Mana Geyser and Jeska's Will that can help us power out Velomachus potentially. Urza's Ruinous Blast can just exile everything except for legendary permanents, so we'll be able to keep our Velomachus and exile everything else. Gamble's a really nice tutor here. Mizzix Mastery again is another way we can finish the game. If you've got, like, you know, 5 or 6 extra Dragon's Approaches in your deck, or sorry, in your graveyard already, and then you cast a Mizzix Mastery, that's going to be a lot of damage you could deal to your opponents potentially. Savine's Rex, so we can reanimate maybe like a Dockside, or, you know, maybe some of our ramp pieces. We got stuff like Shronic Resonator and Scroll Racconeer. In the instance, like I said before, you know, it's really hard to balance these kind of decks. So we've, you know, tried to maintain removal to a decent degree. Maybe not as much as the previous version, but the removal we are running is still efficient and will get the job done. We've also added an Enlightened Tutor, which can help us tutor for some of the more important game-ending artifact and enchantments in our deck. And a Reiterate, when paired with either a Jeska's Will or a Mana Geyser, depending on how much mana they're producing, you can create infinite mana. And once you create that infinite mana with Reiterate, you can, like, copy a Lightning Bolt infinitely and deal infinite damage to the table, or you can cast a Dragon's Approach and copy the Dragon's Approach infinitely and do infinite damage to the table that way. So a decent way for us to go infinite there. Lightning Bolt is especially important because if you hit the Mana Geyser off of Velomachus' ability and you have Reiterate in your hand, this can let you cast the Mana Geyser and then start the Reiterate loop. But because when you leave combat, all that red mana is going to go away, you can do the Lightning Bolt at instant speed and kill everybody that way with the infinite mana and the Reiterate, since you don't want that. It's not going to do anything if the mana falls out, right? So, and in the artifacts, we've just kind of fixed up our ramp a little bit, more 2-drop kind of stuff. I do like Gilded Lotus in these kind of decks where your commander is kind of expensive, since Gilded Lotus will, you know, you pay 5 and the next turn you've got access to 8 mana, so you can cast Velomachus and maybe do something else depending on if you drop another land or not. And we've added a Mana Bolt. Again, our commander is super expensive, so an extra, you know, rock that can get us there is going to be really nice. Scroll Rack is also really good. If we have an instant or sorcery that we don't want in our hand anymore, we can put that back on top of our library. It also pairs really well with land tax, so we can, you know, get a bunch of lands into our hand, put those on top of our library, and then essentially draw a bunch of cards. So if we, like, land tax 2 turns in a row, we've got 6 lands in our hand, we could put 6 lands on top of our deck, and then put 6 cards from the top of our deck into our hand. So it's a lot of card advantage. Strionic Resonator is another card we can use to copy Velomachus' ability. Very, very strong. And the Helm of the Host is another really cool card in the deck. So at the beginning of combat, you get to create a token that's a copy of the equipped creature, except for it isn't legendary. So with Velomachus, we'll be able to get multiple Velomachuses going, and from there, we will be, you'll deal a lot of damage because you're swinging at players, but also you can get multiple triggers off. That's the important thing. So that just multiple Dragon's Approaches during combat is going to be super strong. Future Jacob here. I completely forgot to talk about Thrumming Stone. So Thrumming Stone is a 5-mana artifact. It's going to be one of the ways that we can end the game. So it gives spells you control Ripple 4, and Ripple 4 essentially means that when you cast a spell, you reveal the top 4 cards of your library, and all spells that have the same name as the spell you cast, you can cast those for free. Essentially what's going to happen is we cast our Dragon's Approach, we'll reveal the top 4. Because of the density of the Dragon's Approaches in our deck, we are probably going to hit at least 1 Dragon's Approach, and if we cast that Dragon's Approach, that will trigger again, because Ripple doesn't care about where you're casting that spell from, it only cares that you are casting the spell. So if you cast 1, it can hit another, and then if that one hits 2, then you get to Ripple 2 more times, and it can really kind of just get crazy. And since each Dragon's Approach is going to deal 3 damage to your opponent, this could very well, it will end the game very quickly. Even if you whiff 1 or 2 times, it will still make your Dragon's Approaches deal a lot of damage, and you could potentially, be able to sacrifice or exile your Dragon's Approaches and get a dragon out off of just 1 Dragon's Approach, which could be pretty powerful. So. And with our enchantments, Fiery Emancipation is going to make our Dragon's Approaches deal 9 damage instead of 3 damage. Also, Velomachus swinging for 15 is pretty good too. Pyromancer's Ascension lets us reuse those Dragon's Approaches that are in our graveyard. I think this card is a ton of fun in these decks. And a Smothering Tithe to help ramp in the early game. And of course, we still got that land tax. Helps us just get lands out and has the really nice synergy with the Scroll Rack. With the lands, we've upgraded our lands just a little bit. We've added a Crystal Vein that can help power out Velomachus potentially by sacrificing it to make 2 colorless mana. We've added an Aganjo and a Scavenger Grounds to help deal with graveyards. Hall of Heliod's Generosity can, potentially get back a really important enchantment if it happens to be destroyed. But yeah, generally these 2 color decks, it's not too hard to upgrade these mana bases essentially, so pretty easy. Before I move on to the glory version of Velomachus, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know in the comments what commander you want to see brewed next, and just what you did with your Velomachus. I am very interested to hear your take on this commander. And moving on to the glory version of Velomachus, which is essentially cEDH, and this was a lot of fun. This was a lot of fun to brew. So if you're familiar with Narset, the Jeskai one, where you can attack and get to cast all the non-creature spells for free, I kind of wanted to do that with this deck, where once you swing once with Velomachus, you're probably the odds that you just win the game are going to be pretty high in terms of the density of extra turn spells and extra combat spells. So it gets pretty nuts. We've got a Gideon of the Trials as well as this Cloudstone Curin. So these cards are super important. The last ability of Gideon says you get an emblem with, as long as you control a Gideon Planeswalker, you can't lose the game and your opponents can't win the game. Cloudstone Curin also says the same thing. You can't lose the game and your opponents can't win the game. These cards are going to be really important, and we'll get to that once we get to the instants and sorceries. Since we do have a few equipment in the deck, I've added an Arden to help cheat some of those equipment costs, and some really great cEDH type staples like the Archivist of Ogma, which can let us draw cards, as well as the Esper Sentinel, Imperial Recruiter, so we can tutor out some of the important stuff. Since we are going to be taking extra turns in this deck, Grand Abolisher is going to be really great in stopping our opponents from interacting with us and all the extra turns we're going to be taking. We've added a Godo Bandit Warlord, which, since we saw in the previous deck that Helm of the Host, thought it would be a good idea to just throw a Godo in there. It does give us extra combats even outside of that combo, but if we do happen to find Godo early, we can potentially, just win the game with the Godo combo, the Godo Helm of the Host combo. Again, we've got that Dockside Extortionist. We've added a Drain Magistrate since it's super powerful. Neheb is another one of our combo pieces that we will use with Aggravated Assault. And then we've also added a Combat Celebrant. This is also another card that can combo with Helm of the Host, since you can make a copy of Combat Celebrant and swing with it, exert it. Then the next combat, you'll make another Combat Celebrant. You'll attack with it and exert it, and get infinite combos that way. Dualcaster Mage. For the Twin Flame combo, it's always a good idea to have some kind of, a commander agnostic combo, and this is probably one of the more efficient, combos in red, the red-white kind of colors in terms of cEDH. We've got the Treasonous Ogre, which can really help power out a Velomachus or even a Godo if it happens to be in our opening hand. So very strong card there. In our sorceries, we've added a few really interesting tutor options. So Search for the Glory and Call the Gatewatch are both really strong for tutoring out the Gideon of the Trials, since it is pretty important to our game plan. Search for Glory can also tutor out one of our legendary creatures, so Godo or Neheb the Internal, or even the Arden if we really need to. The Gamble again is our another great tutor. And then we've got a few cards like Last Chance and Warrior's Oath, and these cards say take an extra turn after this one, you lose the game at the end of the next turn. And so essentially with these cards, we're going to lose the game at the end of the next turn. But if we have a Cloudstone Steel Kieran or the Gideon out, you won't lose the game because you can't lose the game. So essentially these cards become extra turn spells, and they're very powerful in this context. Steel Shaper's Gift to help us tutor out for some of the really important artifacts, or rather equipments, sorry. It can also tutor out the Cloudsteel Kieran, since it is an equipment, funny enough. So we have a few extra combat spells in here too, but much like I was talking about in the Skirmish version here with the Seize the Day, again, if you, with cards like Seize the Day that say after this main phase you get an additional combat phase, they don't work with Velomachus. So we do have the cards that just say that you get an extra combat regardless of what phase you're in, essentially. So with World at War, after this first post-combat main phase, this turn, there is an additional combat phase followed by an additional main phase. At the beginning of that combat, untap all creatures you control. So if you hit this off of Velomachus, it will work, because you'll be in combat, you'll cast the World at War, and then you'll move to your first post-combat main phase. And at that point, you'll get an extra combat phase after that. Now, if you've already taken a combat before you've cast this World at War, it won't work, because it says after the first post-combat main phase this turn. So just be wary of that as you're kind of stringing together extra combats potentially in this deck. That World at War needs to be the first extra combat spell that you cast in that turn if you want to use it in that context. Open the Armory, another really great option to tutor for the equipment in our deck. And moving on to the instants, we got a few more pretty spicy. Includes Chance for Glory is another card we can cast to take an extra turn where you lose the turn at the beginning of that instep. Final Fortune, also another card that lets you take an extra turn where you lose the game. Savage Beating is another extra combat spell we can use. So untap all creatures you control, and after this phase there is an additional combat phase. It doesn't matter when you cast it, it is an instant, and it is only allowed to be cast during combat, so you are casting it at the appropriate time. We've added a few rituals to help us power out Velomachus a little bit sooner. Magnetic Theft is actually pretty potent in this deck, much like the Arden, to help us cheat the equip costs. This will, again, help us cheat equip costs, and we can equip things at instant speed, potentially, if it really matters. But yeah, we've basically just, we've kept our removal nice and, concise, essentially, keeping it cheap. But yeah, nothing over the top here. Just pretty much the best removal spells we could have in these colors essentially. Moving to the artifacts, we have definitely upgraded our ramp package here. Added cards like Jewel Lotus, Lotus Petal, Chrome Mox to really emphasize getting out the Velomachus ASAP. Added a Cursed Totem because we don't really have a lot of activated abilities in our deck outside of like the Treasonous Ogre, which is probably, it is the only activated ability in our deck. Outside of the Cloudstone, since it is a creature when you cast it, the reconfigure won't work since it's a creature with Cursed Totem. So yeah, we've got the 2 cards that kind of is a non-bo in our deck, but it's worth because we don't really need that too much. And we also have the Arden, which can kind of get around that by just equipping things for free. So as far as our equipment, we've got a Sword of Feast of Famine, which can be a really nice combo piece with the Aggravated Assault. So when you hit a player, you get to untap your lands, and then with the Aggravated Assault, you can pay the 5 mana, get an extra combat, just take infinite combats from there. Helm of the Host with the Godo is super strong, and it's also just really strong outside of that combo if we draw it early with the Velomachus, since we are going to get extra combats, and yeah, if you get extra combats with this card equipped to a Velomachus, things get kind of nuts, because first combat, you're going to make a Velomachus, take the extra combat, then you're going to make another Velomachus, and then you get 3 triggers, and then if you hit another combat spell, you're going to make another Velomachus, and then you get 4 triggers. And I mean, it's pretty, like, it's not like an infinite combo kind of thing, but you are going to take a lot of extra turns, a lot of extra combats, and at that point you're probably just going to kill your opponents just through combat. So another interesting combo we have is the Spellbinder. So if we have one of the Chance for Glory or the Final Fortune or even a Savage Beating in our hand, we can exile that with the Spellbinder, and with that we can either take infinite turns or infinite combats with the Velomachus. Again, we've got the Strionic Resonator, so we can copy those Velomachus triggers, and a Scroll Rack just to kind of help move around. If we've got some of the spells in our hand that we don't want anymore, we can put them on top and cast them with Velomachus, stuff like that. In our enchantments, we've pretty much just reduced it down to the Aggravated Assault, and we've added the Underworld Breach, which another commander agnostic combo that we can use to win the game. We've got the Grinding Station, which, if you've seen this before, you sacrifice an artifact and you target player mills 3 cards. So if you have Underworld Breach, Grinding Station, and something like a Mox Opal, tap your Mox Opal for mana, sacrifice it, mill yourself, cast your Mox Opal again by exiling the 3 cards you milled, tap it again for mana, and then you can sack it again with the Grinding Station to mill yourself 3 more, because whenever an artifact comes into play, you get to untap it. And essentially, you do this over and over again until you find a part of your combo, one of your actual combos, like an end the game, and then you just end the game from there. Probably the easiest ones to do is just something like the Dualcaster Mage plus Heat Shimmer or Twin Flame is going to be probably your easiest bet in terms of winning the game that way. But still a very powerful card in its own right, even if you're in a weird situation where you can't really end the game. So in our lands, we definitely made a bunch of upgrades here. Cards like Ancient Tomb and the Urza Saga can help us find some of our ramp and just power out Velomachus, a bunch of fetch lands. The fetch lands will help thin out the deck, which is really important. Helps us hit our instants and sorceries more consistently. And we've also got just a bunch of lands that are going to be able to tap for either color, and we don't really have to worry about colors at that point. So thanks for checking out this episode of Opal Wave MTG. Again, I am your host Jacob, and until next time.